I had decided to make a small journey to a location not too far away from where I am staying, a church that has stood for almost 1,000 years, St. Dunstan's All Saints in Stepney. I needed to go as there was a known merchant there who had some specifics I was after, and he always managed to find me some art supplies. I don't know how, but his street urchins would be able to locate you almost anything for a price. Since the blighting, money had lost any form of real value, but as trading in skills was not as frequent as you might expect, we all continued to still use coin without question. Outdoor work in the inner city was far too treacherous for anyone to want to do. There were some that did out of sheer necessity, but more often than not, people didn't want to draw any form of attention to themselves, so they got it done shoddily and quickly. I gathered my pistol and blade, as well as various, in case of emergency, bits and pieces I brought with me every time I went out. Some flame paper, a bottle of bodak residue, some incendiary devices, etc. I affixed my face covering and put on my coat before stepping outside. The air was pungent as always, muted by my trusty scarf, but certainly still noticeable. A tepid fog hung, and the street was, as it always is, deathly silent. That isn't to say there were no people. They just scurried between the shadows and alcoves or remained indoors afraid to make a sound. The cobblestone, covered in emulsified dried blood and grit from an altercation the night previous, would squelch and grind as I trudged through, making sounds that would cut through the mist with the invisible edge of a straight razor. The walk felt long and tense, abundant in an absence of sound, naught for the wind and shrill calls of a massacre of volaks that glided distantly overhead. The grinding of my boots on paved street soon became a dull rustle as I stepped onto the limp, lifeless grass of the fields that surrounded the church. The lawn was punctuated evenly, with the aged gravestones of those long since passed, and the loose mounds of dirt topped with haphazardly made wooden crosses scrawled with the names of those less fortunate in the present. The fog had grown so dense, it wasn't until the cracked spires of the church loomed over me that I had any physical sense of where I was. The doors of the church had been kicked in by desperate people long ago, hoping for sanctuary, leaving the wooden planks broken and splintered like teeth in the moor-like entrance to the imposing church's nave. At the end of the darkened room, littered with the remains of pews, succumbed to the damp air and the will of time, was a striking stained glass window, fully intact, depicting the Archangel Gabriel, under which was the altar, repurposed as a table which all manner of items needed sat atop.
"Hello there, Leighton,"
Albert announced. Albert was a slightly rotund, broad-shouldered man with a large greying mustache. His hair was dark, receded and thinning. He wore what his profession demanded of him before blight struck London: a yellowing undershirt, black trousers, boots and a blood-splattered apron. His sleeves were rolled up, displaying nautical tattoos under thick arm hair, a woman hanging onto a stone cross amid stormy seas on his left arm, and a swallow carrying the Union Jack on his right.
"Got some new paints in for you. They're a bit squashed and some are used, but once you chip all that dried shite out, there's some good paint in there."
I nodded my head towards him and walked over to inspect the paints. He had an unopened tube of lead white, a battered tube of ochre, some emerald green and a dried up half tube of bone black. As I was looking, Albert mentioned,
"Here, I've been saving this for you. Not that many people are after this sort of thing, but you mentioned you wanted it."
He handed me an unopened tube of aurora yellow, bent and dented. The paint leaked a little where the metal had split slightly, but it was certainly still usable. "Thank you, my friend," I responded. He looked at me cheerfully before placing it into my hand.
One of the urchins found you something too. Thought someone of your talents might find some use for it."
He gestured to one of several children sitting by a fire playing marbles. A boy stood up and grabbed a leather satchel that was leaning against the wall and pulled out 2 pristine detailing brushes, seemingly, somehow, untouched. With an almost ceremonious level of care, he extended the brushes out for me to take. I stood there and pondered. If he took such care in handing them to me, then how on earth did he manage to get them through the city? As I stood there, awestruck at the unsplayed, perfect tips of the brushes, I asked, "How did you—"
"Best urchins in London."
Albert interrupted as he tousled the boy's hair, who chuckled, looking very pleased with himself. I took a knee next to the boy and said, with all sincerity, "Thank you." He smiled at me and ran back to play marbles again with his friends, who patted him on the back and seemed to share in the praise I gave to him.
"I don't know how they do it, but they can always find what you're looking for. Brave little buggers,"
Albert said with a noticeable degree of sympathy in his voice. "Desperate," I replied.
"What's that?"
Albert questioned. "They're desperate. Without you, these children would more than likely not be here," I said as I handed Albert some coin, not focusing on how much I was giving him particularly, just well aware it was more than what he would have asked of me. He looked down at his hand, then back at me smiling, understanding what or who the extra coin was for. I then said goodbye to Albert and turned to leave. With my pistol now holstered, I held the brushes in a firm but careful grasp, and the paints residing in a small satchel Albert had spare, slung across my shoulder. I started back home. The air had grown cold and the overcast sky had darkened, telling me the sun, if there still was one, was soon to set. With haste in my steps, I continued on, skimming past the memorial stones and statues as I left the false sense of security I had nearby the church behind me. Back into the streets of London, I walked staring at the brushes in my hands, holding them with the care one would have when handling a writing or document, the ink on which was still wet. As I gazed down at them, I heard a small knock come from behind me. I turned jarringly to look and saw nothing. Knowing that seeing nothing could very well mean something was there, I pulled out the journal I kept for notes in the inside pocket of my jacket. As a means to protect the brushes, I placed them inside, though they were too long to fit. All that mattered truly was the fibers remained as they were. So, ensuring they were both reasonably safe, I placed them carefully inside and closed the book before putting it back into my pocket. With heightened senses, I continued my journey home as quickly and as quietly as I could when again I heard a knock, only louder this time and accompanied by a crack. As I turned to see what made the noise, the signage of a shop not 10 yards from me swung down and fell to the floor. Unsure of what to do, I was indecisive about fleeing, as the sound surely would have attracted a volak or murmur-beast or who knows what species of diabolical creature. But also, turning my back on the sound went against every one of my instincts. I decided to walk slowly backwards, briefly turning my head over my shoulder to ensure I wasn't about to unknowingly meet my demise. As I walked, I paid close attention to the oddly crumpled shopfront, but my notice was taken by a series of posters, glued to a wall each nearer to me than the last, as they began to curl up and peel, crinkling and fading to resemble one left in the sun for much too long. One by one they disintegrated, some falling to the floor. The paint on a sign leaned up against the lamppost close to me even then the fallen posters began to crack and peel. The black lacquer of the lamppost began to wither and decay, falling into limp shards onto the remains of the sign, now splinters and dust. Trying desperately to understand what was happening, out of confusion and fear, I raised my pistol and fired at nothing. The air was still, even the fog and clouds above had stopped moving. There was not a single sound. When a kingfisher flew down and landed atop the wooden rubble. A kingfisher in London city streets, I said aloud to myself. As I looked and watched, my pistol pointed towards it. The bird looked about the street before it turned its head to me and let out a little bird call. Completely forgetting what I had seen, I chuckled and let a slight smile creep across my face, my pistol lowering, coming to rest by my side. Suddenly, a hand thrust itself around my neck with a grip so tight I could feel its talons digging into the nape, almost certainly breaking the skin. As I gasped for breath and having dropped my pistol, I clawed desperately to remove the vice from around my throat. I opened my eyes to see now a monstrous bird twice my size standing with one foot outstretched, squeezing my neck, letting just enough air pass for myself to remain conscious. My heart raced as the bird leaned towards me menacingly, with one huge, grotesque eye, its pupil undulating and writhing. Worms began to fall from the monstrous creature's eye socket, covering my clothes with a viscous yellow fluid. The floor began to rumble as the sky darkened, the clouds blowing across with a startling speed, and the bird's face twisted and distorted into a mangled, misshapen humanoid that let out a scream one could only compare to the shriek of a fox, but never ending. A crushing sensation that started in my chest was spreading down my arm and numbing my fingers. I heard my blade clatter to the floor as my hand weakened and my vision blurred. Struggling for breath, things became dark, and then... nothing. That's all I can describe. Nothing. After some time in complete darkness, a blue light or flame similar to a will-o'-the-wisp whisked itself down from above me and began to shrink and grow, changing from round to pointed, shaping itself seemingly at random. Soon the shapes looked familiar. Figures, faces, places. It was showing me something. It showed me. My limp body being shaken around and screamed at by the horrifying creature I could now see in its entirety. It was a dreadnought. I should have known. All the signs were there, the decay, the aging and withering. I can only think I was so distracted in keeping safe the brushes a brave or desperate young boy who went through who knows what in order to get them with me in mind, that I simply wasn't thinking properly. As I watched this calming, almost familiar flame show me what was happening, I noticed something. The dreadnought appeared not to know what to do with me. It would look at me and scream, but when my body failed to react in any way, it would just look at me and wait. Then it would try again, shaking me for a response, but nothing. It then placed my body down on the pavement and returned to its original form, one I will go over another time, and with its gaze focused ahead of itself, held its hand out to the side, towards me. The me that is talking to you now, not the one laying dead on the pavement. That is when I realized what was happening. It was bringing me back. Dreadnoughts have no desire to eat what is already dead. They eat you alive and afraid, keeping you conscious for as long as possible and scared for as long as possible. I have seen this happen before, but I never thought I would be one to experience it. I didn't even know I had died. When the world you live in is as full of horrifying surprises as London currently is, you rarely stop to think about what it is you're seeing or experiencing. I had just experienced death. But now I had a distinct advantage. I knew what I was up against, I knew how to kill it, and I had the element of surprise. I extended my hand and gripped its long, mangled fingers. The creature hurled me back into my body. I felt an aggressive thud like I had been thrown onto the street. I very quickly gathered my senses and grabbed a small vial of bodak residue from one of my many self-tailored pockets. I turned around to hurl it at the wall next to me, but was immediately face to face with the dreadnought. It growled through drooling, elongated, thin teeth and slowly extended its bony fingers as its hand crept back towards my neck. I am not afraid of you, I said to the entity. And with that, my hand still raised, ready to smash the vial against the wall, I crushed it in my palm and dropped it, scattering the fine powder over the monster. The bodak, now being forced into my physical reality, leaned away from me, looking with a sense of desperation at its own arms and claws. As it did so, I slowly bent down and picked up my blade, still on the floor beside me. The monster realized what I had done and lunged in attack towards me as I slammed the blade down, lodging it deep into the creature's bone-like head. It fell to the floor and gracefully, collapsing into a heap of tendrils, arms, worms, and facial features. It then turned a chalky white and blew away as dust in the wind. It's only now, with a newly filled bottle of bodak residue sitting beside me, I can say, these brushes were worth every moment of every struggle to get them home unharmed. I do hope you enjoyed tonight's story, be it the first of many for you, or the one and only of mine that you listen to. I truly appreciate you having spent your time with me. For now, I will say goodbye, but do keep an eye out for other writings and short pieces I create about my world, if indeed you are interested. Thank you again, and I hope to see you soon.